and certainly that the White House itself was hoping for. Trump himself called it a big, great progress, quote unquote. But when he was pressed, he admitted that there is no deal until there is a deal. So in other words, we've effectively reached an outcome in which we still don't have a deal. And to my mind, the real winner, I think, of that Alaska summit wasn't Washington or Moscow, it was actually Beijing. I think what's worth mentioning, and I remember seeing this in the Chinese state-run media in advance of the summit, was that China was welcoming this bilateral meeting and saying that it would be good for global peace. And while China didn't actually call for a ceasefire, it has been in the camp of supporting both sides negotiating. And certainly, to my mind, and this is something that I want to get your opinion on, James, Beijing doesn't, in effect, want Russia to lose and actually stands to gain from the Ukraine conflict continuing. And certainly, I think that this relationship between Russia and China will continue to impact China-US and even China-Taiwan relations moving forward. So just a quick question, James. What was your sort of takeaway from the Alaska summit, and how do you think it will impact China?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the revealing things that Trump said was that President Biden did something unthinkable. He drove China and Russia together. And then Trump added that if you're just a minor student of history, that is the one thing you don't want to do. So I think that, there is an interesting angle on this, and that is that the US is clearly thinking that the closeness of Russia and China, those two great powers, huge in terms of territory and population that bestride Asia, having those two countries so closely aligned is not in the interests of the United States. I thought that was a very interesting aspect to what happened in Alaska. And so I think a lot of people are wondering whether or not the US can drive a wedge between Russia and China, whether or not it could even perhaps break up the China-Russia axis. And from my perspective, I have to say, I think this could well be US wishful thinking. And the reason for that I'd like to give is, I went to the Russian border with China about 10 years ago. And while I was there, I stood at this very becalmed city called Heihe, and you're just sort of looking north into the wide expanses of Siberia. It's almost like a place that time forgot. And it's a very evocative place. The river that you're standing by is called the Amur in Russian, but in Chinese it's called Heilongjiang, which means Black Dragon River. And indeed, the flow of that river is so strong and dark that it conjures up the idea that there could be somehow a dragon lurking there. But that was 10 years ago. Really nothing happening on the Russian border, very little commerce, very little trade, and not a single bridge across 1,000 miles of this Amur River that flows between the countries and forms the borders between them. But if you go there today, what you find, I think, supplies the reason why Russia and China will be very difficult for the US to prize apart. And that reason is that there's so much going on now. There's huge border trade. There are 3 bridges over the river now that have been recently built. China is a big customer for Russian natural gas. Trade is now about 220 billion US dollars a year. And the most important glue between Russia and China now is geopolitics. And that's really that China supports Russia in terms of its war in Ukraine. And the reason it does that primarily is because, as you mentioned, Alice, China's biggest geostrategic priority these days is to make sure that if it has to fight a war in Taiwan on its south and southeast border regions down there, then it can do so. It doesn't have to worry about its northern border with Russia becoming unstable. And so for this crucial geopolitical reason, I think that the Russia-China axis will remain pretty strong for probably for some time to come. And that, I reckon, makes Trump's idea that somehow Russia and China being so closely aligned could be a problem, and perhaps that the US could drive a wedge between them. I think that's probably wishful thinking.
I completely agree with that. I think for structural reasons, let's start with those. Russia, energy-rich country, but lacks capital and technology. China, rich in capital and technology. And I've just been looking into some of the data of massive FDI flows in the last few years going into Russian infrastructure and Russian construction. On top of that, we've also got massive tech sales and automobile sales going from China to Russia as well. I think that it's worth mentioning at a personal level, the relationship between Putin and Xi. Xi has met with Putin as a global leader more than any other leader in his time in office. I think he has obviously attached a great deal of personal value to this relationship. And although you hear grumblings at the ministerial level when I go to China, for instance, and talk to people who are policy advisors to Beijing, the grumblings that, Russia historically hasn't been a strategic ally. There has been a history of border conflicts, even as early and more recently in the 60s. But certainly, I think this relationship on personal grounds has become very, very important to Xi Jinping. I would also mention that while I thought that Trump had a narrow window of opportunity at the beginning of his administration to do a reverse Nixon, meaning get closer to Russia at the expense of China, I think he's blown that with his foreign policy, both on Ukraine, but also his trade policy. And I think by basically giving this trade détente to China, which we've seen since the Stockholm meeting, it's effectively, I think, prioritized improved relations with China over really trying to cripple China and get closer to Russia. So I think even although Trump had an opportunity at the beginning of his administration, China and Russia seem to have gotten even closer. What I will have to flag, and I'm curious if you have thoughts on this too, James, is that North Korea has a degree of participation in this conflict too. We've seen North Korean troops going into the conflict in Ukraine. They seem to be profiting from the conflict as well. And this begs the question, how is the axis of ill will, these authoritarian countries from Russia to China to Iran to North Korea faring in Trump 2.0? And how do you think that these authoritarian powers are testing American resolve and American primacy?
Yes, I mean, there does seem, as you say, to be a view out there that we're facing a kind of concerted axis of authoritarian powers against the West. To me, this really is very overblown. I think that each of the powers that are involved in Ukraine are there for their own reasons. Russia, because it covets Ukrainian territory, and because of the character of Vladimir Putin, who sees himself in terms of restoring Russia's historical pride. China's involved, as I mentioned, because it prioritizes its geopolitical relationship with Russia, because it really needs to shore up its southern and southeastern border so that it can, if it comes to it, it can fight over Taiwan. And I think North Korea, in a very sad way, to be honest, is there because it needs to earn the money. I've read that for each of the soldiers that North Korea sends to Ukraine, it's earning about $2,000 a month. And there are other statistics saying that Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, has earned more than $20 billion from sending arms and military assistance to the Ukraine theater. So it seems to me that really North Korea's interest in this is not geostrategic. It's not trying to form some kind of an axis of authoritarian powers against the West. It's just there to make money. And we all know that North Korea is one of the poorest countries on the planet. I myself have been there. It's really a kind of grinding poverty everywhere you look. So I personally think that that those are the main issues in play.
Yeah, one other data point that I think is worth mentioning is just since Russia-Ukraine, the increase in trade dependency between Moscow and Beijing. There's a statistic that in the late 90s and early 2000s, about 10% of Russian exports were destined to China. Now that figure, more recently in the last few years, has reached 30%. I wouldn't be surprised if that grows as an ongoing trend. And it seems that the majority of Chinese imports from Russia are in the form of oil and gas. So about 75% of the imports from Russia going into China are basically oil and gas energy related. And, this is maybe a separate discussion we can have later on about China's energy transition, but it brings about interesting questions about China trying to reduce its energy dependence, trying to create more homegrown varieties, some of them renewable, some of them coal, some of them nuclear. That's a separate discussion, but certainly I think still a timely and a lively one. Let's take a break and stay with us. Welcome back. We're going to talk about the second item on the agenda, and that is how Trump may be learning from Xi Jinping and taking a leaf out of his playbook. What seems interesting to me as somebody who studied Chinese political economy for quite a bit of time is the way in which Trump seems to have been adopting a lot of the techniques that Xi has refined over the last decade or more, whether it's, nationalization of certain companies and industrial policy when it comes to semiconductors, even to some extent crypto. And more recently, I thought this was quite amusing, James, grabbing a golden share in US Steel. And he seems to be personally directing the tech bros and a lot of these CEOs to do foreign investment pledges, both domestic CEOs and foreign CEOs. There's been obviously pressure in the last few years on TSMC to grow its Arizona plant and potentially expand its presence in America. And so some people have hailed this as state capitalism with American characteristics, which is very tongue-in-cheek. But I think it's worth mentioning that in a way, Biden continued what Trump 1.0 did. With the IRA, he launched these subsidies for clean energy and semiconductors. And Trump has just been using the executive authority to push this agenda more aggressively. And you're starting to see an impact on the way that foreign investors are treating America. I sense from my clients that people are a little bit unsure and worried and apprehensive, especially my European clients, about where to invest in America, given the state largesse and uncertainty about where Trump is actually going to direct his attention. So, James, as somebody who has followed America closely too, is Washington's turn towards state capitalism, you think, a smart correction, or is it a risky power grab by Trump? Can he ultimately be as successful as Xi has been?
I really like this phrase that people are using about the U.S. adopting state capitalism with American characteristics. As anyone who's studied China knows, this is a direct echo from Deng Xiaoping's phrase about what the Chinese economy would do, which was adopt socialism with Chinese characteristics. And of course, that opened the door for all of the capitalist reforms that set China onto its current path. So to sort of be using that in a backhanded way about Trump's policies is really highly ironic. But I must say, I have a bit of a personal reflection on this because I went to the TSMC plant in Arizona last year and I was really blown away by it. Of course, this plant costs about 65 billion US dollars to create, and now the full price tag for the whole series of plants that are going to be built there could be as much as 165 billion US dollars. Now that would be the biggest foreign investment in American history, and it was to a significant extent lured to come to Arizona, to Phoenix from Taiwan by the funding from the US Chips and Science Act. I think the TSMC plant in Phoenix got about 6.6 billion in direct funding, and it's able to get about another 5 billion in low-cost government loans. So this was a massive achievement. However, when I was there in Arizona, looking at the clean rooms being taken around this factory that's going to be making close to the cutting edge computer chips that can be made anywhere in the world, there was one really big question that hangs over the longer term viability of this plant, and that was, how much will it cost TSMC to make an advanced chip in Arizona compared to how much it would cost to make the same chip back in Taipei in Taiwan? And the answer that we heard sort of off the record from scientists who'd worked at TSMC was probably about double. In other words, it will be twice as expensive to make those chips in Arizona as it is back in Taiwan. And I think that raises a big question over the viability of US industrial policy going forward. We'll have to see how it all pans out. Maybe the bigger the plant gets, the more the economies of scale start to click in. But back to your opening question, it really is curious to look from here in Europe, I'm based in London now, at the way US policy is turning towards industrial policy and towards this much more state-directed form of capitalism. We've just spent the last really post-war period doing exactly the opposite and looking at countries like China and thinking, oh, well, they can never be successful doing state capitalism. And now it looks like the US is at least flirting with this idea. How do you feel about that, Alice? I mean, do you feel this is sort of a kind of mind-warping moment?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about this. So let's just take it in quick succession. When you were talking about TSMC, it reminded me of what my colleague Chris Miller has been saying recently. Chris Miller, who wrote Chip War. And he was saying recently that cost is definitely an issue. It is way more cost efficient to produce cutting edge semiconductors in Taiwan versus Arizona. That might be true for many years to come. But the bigger issue actually, and it oftentimes is the case when it comes to cutting edge technology, is human capital. So the leading engineers are still mainly in Taiwan. There are not enough bodies, so to speak, to basically bring over to Arizona without compromising the fabs back in Taiwan. So I think that's going to be a key bottleneck for any kind of American domestication of semiconductor production, even although, Trump and his coterie are putting pressure on TSMC to expand production in America. I also think that what is interesting to me when you look at the numbers is that even although you've got big statements about, for instance, the Stargate partnership, over $500 billion for AI, basically integration and infrastructure over the next 4 years being committed by a number of big tech companies. If you add all these I would call it red carpet sums together, it's still orders of magnitude smaller than what China is committing to its infrastructure manufacturing powerhouse. The IMF estimates that about 4.4% of Chinese GDP is spent on industrial policy across subsidies, tax benefits, and land. That is about $700 to $800 billion a year. And the CHIPS Act, by comparison, is only about $75 billion that's just dedicated to semiconductor industry. But even if you sum up all, I think, the red carpet, and I did a back of the envelope pledges, it's still much smaller than China. And I think that the IMF sum probably understates the extent to which policy banks and local government banks are actually financing and subsidizing these firms to continue to grow. I think EVs are a great example of the way in which local governments competed with each other to offer subsidies, low rent, basically free land to these EV manufacturers. A great book on this is obviously Kyu-jun's work, in which he looks at mayor capitalism, the way in which mayors compete for companies to come and basically domicile in particular localities. So I think it's very hard. It's going to be very hard for Trump to steer the whole behemoth that is America towards a sort of Xi-style industrial policy. But my last thought on this, James, as a historian, is that America has flirted with protectionism throughout its history. You only look back to the founding fathers. Hamilton was a big proponent of America being a domestic manufacturing powerhouse. He wasn't so keen about free trade. And then when you move further on into the early 20th century, you also see moves, whether it's the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that were put into place, huge protectionist barriers against imports coming into America, or even FDR in the 30s, where you did actually see a great degree of fiscal stimulus and industrial policy. So I think America has had its history of trade protectionism, of industrial policy, but it's hard to see it ever compete at the level at which China has attained. And a lot of that is structural, I think.
Yes, I must say I agree. And also sitting here in the UK, it strikes me that what the US is doing, it may not be optimal, it may be somewhat wasteful, and possibly the US is creating big cost structures in manufacturing, but at least it's better than what we're doing here in Europe, which is virtually nothing. There is no industrial policy here in a country like the UK. There is no government funding of our chip companies and our tech companies. So perhaps what we have now is China leading the way in industrial policy, as you said, spending hundreds and hundreds of billions on this, and then the US starting to move after it. And at least the US has a highly advanced chip factory there in Phoenix, Arizona. And then Europe really lagging far, far behind.
Yeah, that's definitely a conversation for another podcast, because I think it, to my mind, is quite baffling that Germany, for instance, that was a front runner in manufacturing industry 4.0, which China tried to copy, has really fallen behind in a lot of key manufacturing sectors, not in the least EVs and automobiles. But that's definitely a topic that we can pick up at a later date. I'll end with a thought, and I'm curious again to hear what you think about this. I've been toying with writing this op-ed about Trump's tributary system. I think that Trump's way of holding on to power and treating the rest of the world reminds me of late stage Qing Empire, China, in the way that the Qing Empire is trying to address these quote unquote unequal treaties with foreign countries during the Opium Wars, and in the way in which Trump sees a kind of tributary system in which other countries should pay tribute through tariffs. But that's something that I've been toying with as a concept. I think in some respects, yes, he is learning from Xi, but I think he's learning from some of the sort of 19th century pathologies of late stage Qing Empire.
Well, I mean, you certainly had the right photographs to back up that thesis, with all of the many of the European heads of state standing there or sitting there in front of Trump in the White House as supplicants, really listening to whatever instructions Trump wanted to hand out. I thought that was a very, very big moment in terms of, certainly the visuals in our relationship.
And what was it that Tim Cook gave him? A gold plate in his
that's right, yeah.
Oval Office recently?
That's right.
Yeah, so
tribute.
Quite literally paying tribute. To Emperor Trump. Well, let's take a break here. Stay with us. We'll come back and discuss more on China. Welcome back. Last weekend in Beijing, robots ran, kicked, and some of them fell over a lot at the world's first humanoid robot games. And we saw some of these robots playing soccer, even scoring goals, some of them failing to score goals. We saw some kickboxing bots flailing in midair and a sprinter robot that accidentally knocked over a human. There was much laughter, a lot of clapping, and honestly, it was actually quite impressive, if not a little bit strange and curious. But here's the thing. Engineers say that the crashes aren't failures. They're testing effectively for agility, endurance, battery life, before these robots basically hit the factories and reach consumers in hotels and even our homes. And it's not just fun and games. China is racing the US to lead the future of AI and robotics. And I think this is an interesting story to look into. The way in which China's maybe race to AI is going to be different from the US's. To my mind, when you talk to people in Silicon Valley, they're fixated on AGI, artificial general intelligence, basically reaching a level of superintelligence in which bots will exceed human intelligence. But in China, it seems like they have a more practical, earthy approach. They want to see a way in which they can commercialize LLMs, but as well as LLMs or robots in a form of embodied AI in which people interface with real life robots in real time. So James, you first drew my attention to this. So I'm very, again, curious to hear. Please tell us what you thought about these robot games. Are you an AI believer, and do you think China could be leading this race?
Well, thanks, Alice. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was just so engrossing. The World Humanoid Robot Games, the first one ever, held in Beijing. There were 280 teams that came from 16 countries around the world. And to me, the absolute key moment was when, as you mentioned it, one of the robots that was running the 1,500 meters fell over and then lost an arm. And then it kind of picked itself up and dusted itself off, and it ran sort of staggering from side to side to the finish line with one of the wires that, you know, from its sort of missing arm dangling and flapping in the wind. And to me, the absolute amazing moment was as it crossed the line, the crowd erupted into cheers and clapping. And it was a very human moment for a humanoid robot. And I guess that, you know, everybody loves a plucky loser, whether it's a robot or an actual human being. And I just think that this raises quite a big philosophical question, which is that to what extent are humanoid robots pieces of sort of metal and wire, and to what extent are they kind of taking on human characteristics, or maybe we are investing in them some kind of human characteristic? That certainly seemed to be happening there at the humanoid games. But in terms of economics, this is really a key moment in a very different way. And the thing I'd like to point to is that China has now begun mass production of humanoid robots. This is the first country in the world to do this. There are some very advanced humanoid robots companies in the US, like Boston Dynamics, but moving to mass production, and we've seen this movie so many times before, when China gets moving on mass production, the prices come down. And I was really gobsmacked this week to learn that the cheapest humanoid robot made by Unitree, which is the same company that won many of the races at the humanoid robot games, the cheapest humanoid robot made by Unitree is called the R1, and that now sells for $5,566 US. So that means to me that if you're a wealthy family, a wealthy person, you can afford to have one of these guys hanging around in your front room, or serving your guests at dinner, or doing any number of other things that you might want it to do. Or maybe it's going to be in the hospital, fetching and carrying, or doing some kind of simple medical procedure. I think that the price point really changes everything. And just to give an example of how amazing this is, I did some research online to find out what Boston Dynamics' cheapest humanoid robot costs. And as far as I could make out, it probably costs about $114,000 US. So China's shift to mass production is probably going to create a market that will not just be in China, it will be all over the world. So my main reflection on this is that this is yet another example of China now taking the global leadership in many different technologies. And we can talk about many other things such as factory robots or different forms of AI, as you've mentioned, or even maybe the trend in China these days towards young women having AI boyfriends. And this is something that is really catching on as far as I'm aware. There was a prediction I read the other day in Chinese media that there might be 10 million AI boyfriends to keep, young ladies company in China. So this is all moving into what some people might think is kind of a brave new world. I would probably have a slightly more positive reflection on it. I don't know what you think, Alice. I mean, are you finding this deeply scary, or do you think this is sort of just what the future's going to be?
Well, I mean, James, I'm a Luddite, so even using my cell phone, my smartphone, gets me a little bit anxious. I prefer writing letters, to be honest. So I probably am the wrong youngish person to ask. But you raised something that was quite interesting when you talked about the dating boyfriends, the AI boyfriends. My first reaction was, this is definitely not going to help Xi's demographic drive to get people to have more babies, which he's really been pushing. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of the next 5-year plan in October. And number two, I get a sense, and again, because you've lived there, please tell me what you think. I get a sense that the Chinese adopt technology and will adopt AI more quickly. I mean, domestic Chinese consumers, their uptake will probably be quicker than those certainly in Europe, and maybe even in the US. And my first reaction when you told me about this humanoid games was the fact that in the US, I think maybe it was last year, Kim Kardashian came out with an ad with one of Tesla's robots. I think it was the Optimus robot. And it wasn't clear to me if these robots that Elon is selling, which are high-end robots and very expensive, would be as widespread as the robots that are currently, as you say, in China, orders of magnitude cheaper than their rivals overseas. And so maybe in the next 5-10 years, we see a future in which in the States, only wealthy people can afford these humanoid robots, doing their laundry, making their martinis, mowing their lawns. And in China, you'll get maybe more basic humanoid robots, but they are more integrated and widespread. But again, want to hear what you think about this, but it could be a tale of two different robots, so to speak, and the ways in which consumers interface and use those robots.
I'm sure somebody will write the book, A Tale of Two Different Robots, pretty soon. I personally find this pretty dystopian, to be honest. I just look at the capabilities of these robots, and I just wonder how many people are going to be left with a job when this extraordinary shift in capacity actually becomes more and more widespread around the world. I mean, we're now talking in Beijing, there's an AI hospital where people are treated by robots entirely. There isn't a single human being in the hospital. I have, the children of some of my friends are just starting their careers as nurses. How long will they have a job if humanoid robots are everywhere? To be honest with you, I sort of feel that, as you rightly say, the kind of early adopter verve that you see in China all over the place is pushing ahead so quickly without due consideration for the human impact of all of this. Of course, we can all love it when, an armless humanoid robot wins a running race, and we can sort of feel an empathy with that robot as it crosses the finish line. But do those robots feel an empathy with us when we lose our jobs? I mean, clearly not. I think we're heading into really uncharted territory, and I would just hope that somewhere, some think tank, some respected source starts to think about the human impact of this technological headlong race.
Yeah, such great points. I also think that, modern China has this pathology of overcapacity. It's sort of built in the DNA that you need to have a supply side push, depress prices so that you can keep the manufacturing engine going. And so invariably what we have seen with PVs, solar panels, wind turbines, more recently EVs, will be applied to humanoid robots. And that will have massive implications, not just for China, but globally. I think it's interesting and worth mentioning that Didi is investing a lot of money and attention towards autonomous driving. And we could see very, very soon a rollout of these autonomous vehicles that supplant taxi drivers, gig economy drivers that do deliveries through Meituan, for instance. That is going to have massive implications for unemployment at a time in which we've already seen with this trade war, youth unemployment went back up again to 17.8% more recently in July. This is going to be a very, very difficult job market, I think, for highly educated Chinese youths. And we've never had a more educated Chinese youth in China's history. I think James Liang, who's the CEO of C-Trip, is also a demographer, has mentioned that the current generation of graduate students going to the workforce are going to be the most educated in China's history. And so we're meeting this kind of inflection point in which we are unraveling more of these AI applications. At the same time, you've got a huge glut of these educated Chinese youths that need to figure out where to go. And I think that the Tongping, as you know, the lying flat trend is going to be an ongoing one as we try to navigate where these Chinese employees go. One thing that was struck me when I was doing some research was the fact that China has overtaken Japan in the last few years as being the number one robot producer. Now, as much as 40% of robotic installations are produced by China. The number two producer is Japan at 10% of global installations. So if you think about that, that's a massive market share that is dominated by China. And I wouldn't be surprised that they use their manufacturing engine to push that force into other markets in the EU, where we'll probably see more concerns about Chinese flooding of AI applications and robotics, as well as the rest of the world. So it'll be interesting because it's not just a China shock, it's a China AI shock, which I think could be a sort of round two of the global implications of China's manufacturing machine. Oh. But yeah, I thought that story that you raised, James, was very interesting because it again shows you how China is so unique, not just in the system and the way that it approaches manufacturing, but also in the way that consumers, interact with technology. I think I was struck by the fact that the audience and the interaction was very Chinese. The Chinese have this kind of love of newfangled technology. And they certainly, for instance, I remember the Spring Festival maybe last year when Unitree had the dancing robots and plates. That was a big social media viral story in China. In China, there's a sense that, consumers get very, very excited about these newfangled technologies. And maybe that's not the case in Europe, where I think people are more wedded to legacy institutions.
Yeah, I must say I agree with one of your first points, that the regulators have really got to catch up with the technologists on this one. I think desperately need regulations quickly on what we're allowing these robots to do and protection of our data, protection of our privacy and protection of our jobs. But we're certainly entering really uncharted territory. It's going to be interesting and bracing to watch, I think.
Well, James, can I ask you a question, a more personal question? Would you ever get a humanoid robot yourself?
Never. I think, okay, so let me tell you a story. One of the guys we interviewed in China was the head of a big robotics company in Shenzhen, and he is making factory robots mostly, but he's starting to make humanoid robots as well. And he said, it's my dream that when I'm old, my daughter will not have to take care of me, that I can be taken care of by a humanoid robot or maybe 2 or 3 humanoid robots. And he said, when my mother was old, I took care of her, and I was happy to do that. But my dream is that when my daughter comes to visit me, she won't be giving me medical assistance. She'll be talking to me. We'll be having fun. We'll be interacting, in a more positive way. And I thought, wow, that's quite different from what I had ever imagined. And so I think I'm persuadable. I think I would also like to spend more time having fun with my daughter, let's say when I'm old, rather than her kind of having to work hard to attend to me. Perhaps if that can be done by a humanoid robot, maybe I'm in the same boat as the guy I interviewed who was running this robotics factory in Shenzhen. It's a tough one. This raises a lot of really interesting questions.
Yeah, time will definitely tell. But yeah, we should definitely keep an eye on this and certainly the developments in China as well, where things, as you know, happen very, very quickly. Before we go, I wanted to talk a little bit of history. I'm actually heading to China in a couple of days, and it was very difficult to get meetings on September 3. I don't know if you're aware of this, James, but it's the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, of basically the Sino-Japanese War and Japanese quote-unquote aggression. in mainland China on September 3rd, 2025. And so I was told that a lot of the streets will be closed off. Ministry officials have been told that they are supposed to participate in the parade, as well as some of the organization of the parade. But this is a big episode, I think, in Chinese history. And it's a form of, I think, nationalistic pride, which again taps into what Xi has been trying to do in his revival of a lot of nationalistic elements of China's history. So I thought that was interesting to think about as I head there in the next few days. And that will definitely be top of mind, the way in which Xi is, implementing his ideological vision of China at the ground level. Well, if we fast forward to today and the future, I think, one thing that I would love to do moving forward on this podcast is to get a prediction from each of us about what we think will happen in China, either in the immediate run or in the long term. So James, do you have a prediction of where China's heading? Anything as small as a humanoid robot or as big as macro data?
Yeah, I'm afraid I haven't got a cute prediction. I wish I did. I wish I had some kind of humanoid robot prediction. But I'm going to go for one of the big elephants in the room. And that is that I think this year, the Chinese trade surplus will be the biggest trade surplus in recorded history by any country. And it will exceed $1 trillion. And the reason I make this prediction is because I think this shows how out of kilter the global economy is. I mean, we've been talking back and forth about, what America's doing to try to counter Chinese competition. We've mentioned that Europe is already far behind China in terms of technology these days. And this glaring trade surplus of $1 trillion, if my prediction comes true this year, shows how much of global activity China has amassed within its own border. And I think that countries around the world will struggle to deal with this, not just this year, next year, but in decades to come. So that's the kind of big picture prediction that I'm going to go for. How about you, Alice? What are you looking at?
Well, firstly, I shouldn't say this because we should just try to disagree more often, because, it's an interesting exercise to be contrarian, but I completely agree. I mean, looking at the data, almost every other day, you've seen a lot of front loading. You've seen a lot of rerouting that ultimately gets destined to the US. So rerouting through third-party countries, but ultimately the Chinese surplus keeps growing. So I completely agree with you. I think we'll end up with a massive record Chinese trade surplus because of these tariffs. And for many of these goods, I think rare earths being a great example, magnets being a great example, many of these goods are hard to substitute out of China at scale. My own prediction, I think, is probably more of a micro one, and it was sort of inspired by an article I read more recently about how Manus, the Chinese agentic AI, has moved its headquarters to Singapore. And that drew some degree of ire, I think, from Beijing. But I sense that this is going to be an ongoing trend. There's now speculation that Shein will do the same. I think there's an ongoing trend in which Chinese companies feel as though they need to drop, for lack of a better word, the yoke of being a Chinese company, and wanting to be a more global company. And so Singapore ends up being a natural, I think, watering hole for these companies. I think even though we're seeing a policy pivot where Xi has been more supportive of Chinese tech, I think Chinese tech companies are still wanting to rebrand themselves as global companies and not just Chinese companies, because they're fully aware of the backlash that is.
$6,000 an hour number. I was staggered by that.
I think they're getting a deal. Didn't he have like $1 billion when he showed up and said, "Hi, I'm from Chipotle," and everyone went, "Oh my God, he must be amazing."
Exactly.
Do you go into Starbucks? Do you like Starbucks?
No, I've actually got a Joe and the Juice here. I was deciding between Starbucks and Joe and the Juice, and I went with this. Because I just don't enjoy the experience inside the Starbucks store anymore. It feels like a fast food restaurant.
That's interesting. So back to me, I was in Northern Europe. I was in Oslo or Denmark, one of those Northern European countries where they all seem really happy. Mm-hmm. And, they pay 90% taxes and there's no homeless people. I met these guys. I was there and I met a friend and he said, "Oh, we're meeting up with some guys." And these guys, I thought they were a boy band because we were mobbed when we went out. Everyone wanted to talk to them. They're all these handsome guys in their 30s, and they were huge celebrities. I'm like, who are these guys? And I'm like, oh, they're the founders of Joe and the Juice. And I'm like, that's the open AI of Denmark or Norway or something.
That's right. That's right.
And I started going there. I get the protein buzz, I think, and I get the tunicado.
Everyone loves those tunicados.
Where does Ed Elson spend his money? Like what gym are you at? What restaurants do you eat at? What are your go-tos?
I eat in a lot these days, Scott. I do a lot of cooking. I meal prep throughout the week.
You cook?
I do a lot of cooking now.
Oh, God, you're so sexy. I can't handle it.
I really upped my game.
Where do you shop for groceries? Let's get to know the real Ed Elson. Where do you shop for your groceries, Ed?
I go to Whole Foods, and a lot of people don't like that.
Someone's making too much money. Memo to self.
I'm one of these Maha moms. I care a lot about seeing that organic label. I know it's all bullshit, but I still care about it being organic.
I remember when I decided to change my life in 2000 when my whole world crashed, and I was living in San Francisco doing internet, and I was married, and I'm like, I don't like any of these things. I don't like tech. I don't like San Francisco. I don't like being married. And so I ended all three of those things and moved to New York with no job, didn't know anybody. And I finally got invited to a dinner party. My friends all were like, what happened to Scott? Like, he freaked out and pressed the restart button on his whole life. He's going through some sort of crisis. And a friend of mine said, I know some people. And I was like the first dinner party I was ever invited to in New York. And I thought, I'll show up at Whole Foods because I don't want to show up empty-handed. So I went to Whole Foods, bought a bottle of wine, and I bought the most beautiful these bulbous grapes. I picked out just like a big bunch, and they were just so beautiful. And there was like a giant, I don't know what you call them, batch herd pride school of grapes.
Bunch.
And I walked up, and she said, okay, put them here. And she weighed them, and she looks at me, and she's like, she was embarrassed. She goes, it's $37 for the grapes. And at that moment, I had what I thought was one of my best impromptu moments. I ate one of the grapes and said, how much is it now? And I'm like, and so I showed up with my wine, and that was my opener. I'm like, these are $37 grapes. These are let's all enjoy these. These cost $37.
I love that. That's good. It's interesting. You had that moment where you just hit the reset button. I wish we had a whole podcast to talk more about that. Can we get like a quick summary of what happened? What motivated this life switch up?
Something to do with abandonment of my father, chemical depression, and mixed with extraordinary amounts of selfishness. And also like the shitty weather and politically like overly woke San Francisco. And also I think I had a wonderful partner, a really good person. I just didn't want to be married. I was too immature. I didn't like it.
Do you feel like you became less mature, or were you always immature? And what changed?
Oh no, I was always immature, but because everyone around me was getting married, I thought that's just what you were supposed to do. And I found someone who was amazing, and so I got married for a right reason or a wrong reason, but I was very much seduced by New York. I came back to New York a few times. I'd started a firm called Prof, which, by the way, just got fired from Cracker Barrel for changing their logo.
I know. I was going to say, we got to talk about that.
Anyways, I love that. But I came back to New York a bunch for meetings, getting clients. And San Francisco, I always thought, which is quite frankly, as a city, a business community, so full of shit. Like all these, I was raising money, doing internet and e-commerce companies, and all these VCs during the day, the most rapacious, like a hardcore, disingenuous, total fucking douchebags I had ever met in my life. And then at night, they wanted to save, they had fundraisers to save the whales. I just thought it was such a disingenuous environment. I didn't like tech. I didn't like the community. I didn't like the weather. And I couldn't stand how, I don't like political extremism. I would never want to live in a deep red state. I don't like living in deep blue. And people say Manhattan is deep blue. I don't agree. Anyway, and then I went back to New York, and people work really hard. They're very open and honest. Can we make money together? No, your idea is stupid, Scott. We're not interested. I didn't mind that. In San Francisco, I found it was just constant grin fucking, like constant, like, we need to see another year of renewals, but let's stay in touch. We really like this company. And I'd walk out and there's no fucking way they're investing. Anyways, New York was much more straightforward. And then at night, every night, they'd go out and party like fucking rock stars with really hot people and great cocktails. And I'm like, I have found my people. No mountain biking, no Patagonia, no like, solve the unhoused problem and don't man the table, staff it. I'm like, people were I just thought these are my people. And I thought, I want to move here. At that time also, it helps to think you're going to be rich, to be really selfish. I thought I was going to be rich because it was 99 and I was looking at jets and I thought I was going to be, a billionaire.
Oh, so that coincided. You get rich, you start looking at jets, and then you're like, okay,
I'm out.
Time to switch up.
Yeah, see above selfish. Yeah, no, it was definitely like a total lack of character.
I love that.
Karma's a bitch. I literally moved to New York and the dot bomb implosion happened. And I moved to New York during the faculty at NYU where my starting salary was $12,000 a year. And I don't know why, but I went through this stage. God, I'm so glad you asked about me. I went through this stage where I became a caveman. I bought a loft with the little money I had. And I was working maybe 2 days a week at NYU in the marketing department and as an adjunct professor. And I would literally only leave the house to eat or try and find someone to have sex with. That was it. I was living like a fucking caveman. And I read this article that said, I decided to become an island. I remember saying to my ex, you can have all of our friends. I don't even want to stay in touch with these people. I'm like, they're all yours. I want the dog, but you can keep all of our friends. And I moved to New York. What a guy. What a great guy. And I remember thinking, I lived that way for actually a couple years. And it was a life void of all meaning. But as far as a life void of all meaning goes, it was pretty good. And then I remember thinking, I'll be dead at 55 if I continue to live this way, if I isolate from everybody and everything and just make enough money to go to St. Bart's and go on dates and occasionally like buy a nice pair of shoes and have a flat screen TV. I thought, this is all I need.
It sounds pretty miserable. You didn't feel miserable?
Oh, no, I liked it. No, I was comfortable being alone. But I did do the research and I literally came to the conclusion, if I continue to live this way, I will die in my 50s.
You had to read an economic study to justify why he should change.
I remember thinking, I kind of like this, like living in New York, I'm an island, no responsibilities. And then I kind of figured out, okay, I'm going to die very early if I continue to live this way. So I got much more into work, much more into relationships, started making new friends, met someone much hotter than me that demanded that like I act like a grown man, which was a real bummer. Anyways, but that was basically my exodus.
Have you ever seen the movie About a Boy?
Oh, one of my favorites.
That's my favorite movie.
Really?
That's my favorite movie.
We have that in common.
Yeah.
You have no idea how much that resonated. That guy decided to be an island, and then he realized that life is about relationships.
That's right. Okay, that's great. I'm glad. That's my favorite movie of all time.
Wow. We are finding common ground here, Ed.
I'm the Nicholas Holt to your Hugh Grant.
Enough about me. Tune in next week for what happened when the great financial recession hit me in New York. All right. The life of a low character, selfish person.
And his rehabilitation. Well, let's get to our interview. For our guest this week, we have Catherine Ann Edwards back on the podcast. She is a PhD economist, economic policy consultant, and economist for Bloomberg News. She is our labor market expert. Let's bring her in. Catherine, thank you very much for joining us again on Prof G Markets.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me back.
So I would like to start with this government shutdown, which of course is putting a lot of people out of work right now. Could you just give us sort of the labor market expert's guide to the government shutdown? What's happening and what should we be concerned about?
When we look at the U.S. labor market, we're looking for signs of strength from its cyclicality. Are we in a good or bad period of expansion or contraction? And then we look at these real-time measures that could be signs of those weakness. The government shutting down isn't happening because tariffs have hit the economy too hard or households have pulled back on consumer spending. It's not showing us some fundamental weakness in terms of how the economy is doing, but it is going to hurt the labor market. It's going to hurt a lot of people who aren't going to get earnings, who aren't going to have services fulfilled, whether that's federal employees or the offices and people that they're directly serving. And so that will hurt aspects of the economy. Some people will say it's unnecessary pain coming at a time when we could really use with less pain. But it doesn't necessarily portend that, a recession is going to come afterwards because of the hit the economy took. I mean, it is fixable and in some ways reversible, except for the excess cost to taxpayers.
The other implication of these shutdowns is that we're not getting any data. This is like possibly the darkest week for data that we've seen, because we're not seeing data from the government right now, and then it's also been a quiet week already. What do you do about that as an economist? If you're not getting the data right now, how much of a problem is that, especially if you're trying to figure out what on earth is going on in the labor market?
It really is going to depend on the length of the shutdown. So the shutdown started, the September jobs report, which we should have gotten the first Friday of October, it was already done. Like the data was collected, they release it to the White House and the Federal Reserve a day before they release it publicly. So the shutdown started on Wednesday and the report was due Thursday morning. All of that data is collected and compiled and completed. We know what happened in September. What's at risk now is data collection for October. Now, data collection for the employment situation happens right at the completion of the week of the 12th. So if you looked at a wall calendar, whatever row 12 is on for October or in any month, that's the row of the reference week. And so when that week is finished, that's when we start data collection. In the 2013 shutdown, they had to basically start collection a week late. It was a 2-week shutdown. They started a week late. They came out with a week late jobs report, but they did a lot of estimates that the data itself wasn't collected. So if this is short enough, we kind of got a freebie week because the 12th is a Sunday, which means we have basically an additional week before we are supposed to be starting data collection for the jobs report. So there's still a chance that the disruption will be very, very minimal to data collection.
I feel as if at least when I look at the economic data that's coming out, the term I think of is dogs watching television, and that is, I know something's going on, but I don't know what's going on. I see so many mixed signals here. When someone asks you, what is the state of the U.S. economy right now? How do you summarize what's going on in the economy?
That is a good question. And the dogs watching television is a moment that we all feel, however much we know about the economy or not, because I tend to tell people two things. One is that we are starting to see stagflation, which is itself a pretty confounding state for the U.S. economy. It's not normally the case that as the economy slows, prices would increase. We're not seeing now, and then now you have to separate in your mind of like, okay, what is evidence of the economy slowing, and then what is evidence of prices increasing, and what are the pressures on the two of them? We haven't seen the economy slowing in the GDP report, but we've certainly seen it in the job market. And a job market that has been tepid for the entire year is still not posting good numbers, whatever they were going to put up for the September report. That should trigger a lot of things on the price side that we're also not seeing. So I think where we are right now is waiting to see which way is it going to break. Is the labor market going to tank before, the tariffs and the price effects go into effect, or are the prices going to climb first? And that will give us some direction of like what is the dominant force on the economy. But I think some of the confusion comes from, one, we're really looking at the effects of uncertainty first and foremost, and two, it could break in one of two directions, if not both. And so it's not just that the data isn't clear, it's that it's being pulled in two different directions. And so it's kind of hanging out in the middle, switching a little bit between them. So what I think the economy doing is suffering under terrible economic policy and a lot of uncertainty that is spooking a lot of people. Does that mean it's what it means for young people, what it means for the market, what it means for price indices, what it means for Fed funds in the future. Like, I think that's almost the easier question to answer, because the economy itself is kind of on a few different precipices.
We also saw this ADP jobs report last week, which found that it only measures the private sector. And this sort of plays into this discussion we were having about what data do you look at? We don't have the government data right now, so we turn to the ADP. It told us that the private sector shed 32,000 jobs in September, which was a pretty notable decline. But it also said that annual pay was up 4.5%. There are a few questions here. One, what do you make of the data? And then two, do we trust the ADP? I know that there is some debate among economists that it's actually that reliable. I don't really know about the nuances of why it isn't that reliable, but your reactions to that report we saw last week.
Oh, well, I was not thrilled to see a negative number because, as much as we like to say that economics is a science, it's so much mood. And if you spook people, especially people who sit on corporate boards, who see a downturn coming, they're going to be in line to be the first to do layoffs. And so any negative number, you followed by a government downturn, it's not going to instill confidence in the economy for the rest of the year. And that's what I saw. Now, the accuracy of the ADP report, I think you just have to take it on face value. You have to understand for any piece of data you get, it's going to come with a pretty closed border around it of where you can take it as an implication versus where you shouldn't apply it anymore. And like, what is the border of information or border of implications that come from this ADP number? I don't tend to watch the two in tandem, I guess is another way of saying, where I'm not like, well, here's what ADP says and then here's what BLS says. I just take them as separate measures, measuring different things. What I found almost more worrying was the wage growth. Because wage growth should happen when the economy is strong and there's lots of people getting jobs and they're bidding. We think the primary mechanism for wage increases in the United States is getting an outside offer. We're moving to an offer with higher pay. Wages going up when hiring isn't is suggesting that there's almost like a culling of the workforce so that the lower paid stagnant jobs aren't there anymore. So one way to remember this was in the pandemic, we saw one of the largest increases in wages we've ever seen in the US because so many low-wage workers were fired. So if the private sector is reporting high wage gains, that could be a composition effect of they're missing a lot of entry-level people, or they're not replacing people who leave, when they leave for whatever reason. So high wage growth with low job growth is not good.
When I saw that headline, when I saw that data, my mind immediately went to what the tech companies are doing. And that is very similar to what you just described, where you have this amazing new technology called AI. They are offering several tens, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars to the top AI scientists and AI researchers in the world. They're turbocharging their business with AI. They're making a lot more money with AI if you're someone like Meta. And at the same time, they're laying people off in record numbers. And something we've discussed on the show before is, this idea, layoffs, it used to be, at least in the world of finance and the world of tech, layoffs used to be sort of a negative forward-looking indicator. It's like, oh, what went wrong? They're laying people off. But it seems that with AI, we've switched into a different mode where actually, if you're laying people off, that is a bullish signal because it shows that you don't need all these people to run your business. You can get robots and AI to do it. And it means you have more money left over to pay for the top talent. I look at the ADP report. It tells me a similar story. I know that AI isn't the whole economy, but they seem to be at least rhyming here. Do you think that is perhaps what is going on in the economy at large?
Or they've spent so much money on AI, they don't have leftover for payroll.
Right.
There's only so much money a company can spend in a year. And so if they're tripling down on an AI investment, that money has to come from somewhere. And, we know the economy is not giving them money hand over fist. So they're making a calculated choice about where to invest, and they're choosing. I see it in some ways if they're choosing robots over people. Your point on this report, it really makes me want the BLS employment situation where we can look at, the full scope of industries and how how each industry is evolving. Information has been flat for about a year. So I would want to see kind of the drops that ADP would suggest concentrated in the industries that you're talking about and be able to really hone in on it. Because, AI wouldn't explain like sluggish retail. For all the talk about the tech sector, it's actually split up in terms of their actual industry, as in some of them can be in professional business services, some of them are in information, some of them are in retail, trade, and we think of tech separately from how the Bureau of Labor Statistics would define them. The question I've gotten most over the past 2 months is there a good private sector replacement for the Bureau of Labor Statistics data? And the answer is unequivocally not. And you kind of hear it in conversations like this where, man, if it really is 32,000 jobs lost, I want to know to the most detail possible which sector was driving that versus if it's professional or business services, versus health.
We've been thinking about this question of alternative sources a lot recently because of the shutdown and also because of just this general defunding and antagonism towards agencies like the BLS. We saw the firing of the BLS chief. We see the political attacks on these data collection services. And so we have been thinking the same thing. Do we need to start moving towards alternative sources of data? And that's what we've been looking at. The other week, we had a whole discussion about the economy that was tied to sales of hamburger helper as a sort of indication of where is the economy going.
Oh, gosh.
Apollo just released this, actually, I think, quite brilliant report that collected all of these different sources of alternative data. They looked at the amount of times that people are going to visit the Statue of Liberty. They look at, Las Vegas room nights. They had all of these different things. And I was sort of thinking, okay, maybe this is the new direction in terms of economic data collection. This is what we should do about the economy now. Sounds like you think, no, we need to double down on BLS. We need more funding in the government. We need better data collection services from the federal government.
Yes, 100%. Well, and it's worth noting that so many of these alternative sources are built on BLS data. Even the ADP report, if you read the last report, they had lots of notes about how the BLS data benchmark revision affected their model because their model is in part trained on and meant to mimic what they think is happening in the BLS. And so to find a truly divorced from public data alternative measure that does not either validate their strength of their data using the BLS is truly hard to come by. This is in some ways happening in 10 different arenas right now. We had a part of our economy or of our public policy that had been made weak from neglect, that wasn't batting 1,000, and then was attacked by the Trump administration. And we're left to wonder what happens next. And it's almost, the answer had been there for 20 years. But we're being pushed, we're kind of pushing our, holding pattern to the limit. Like you can't function in a $30 trillion economy with the data that you need to manage it if you are starving your statistical agencies for funds, which we've been doing for the past 15 years. Firing the BLS commissioner, halting government data collection. We are pushing over the edge something that was already deeply problematic. So we can see this as we should have done the right thing 20 years ago, but doesn't matter when you get to the party as long as you brought a bottle of wine. Like, let's go, fix the BLS now. And for what it's worth, prior BLS commissioners, they have in the American Statistical Society and the Society of Federal Statisticians, which actually is an acronym that's like 6 different words and I'll never remember them, but they have a plan for basically what I joke is the one big beautiful BLS, where it's like statistics 3.0. We know exactly what to do to the statistical agencies to make modernization efforts. They know what to do. They need the money and the authority. So but I think this is happening on so many levels of like how we're talking about data collection is how maybe someone at the National Weather Service or NOAA is talking about their models that they haven't been paid to improve, or various government agencies, and everybody's been starved for investment for a while.
And then when they inevitably get something wrong, everyone turns around and says that it was politically biased. And it's like, okay, well, just look at the last 20 years. They haven't been getting any funding. I mean, it's ridiculous to me, but this to me seems to be the playbook. You basically starve these agencies of funding, and then you say the reason that you're messing up isn't because you don't have the money and the technology that everyone else has. It's because you're politically motivated or you're biased in some sort of way. It drives me insane, as you can tell.
Well, yeah, it's convenient and obvious and just a touch lazy. It's hard to do good work. And so it's easy to attack it. But that doesn't mean that we should stop advocating or stop relying on the BLS. I mean, I love the blossoming of alternative data is great because no single piece of data is ever going to be complete. The unemployment rate is never going to describe how most Americans feel about the economy or how they feel in the labor market. So the more data we have, the more we learn and the more we can act on it. But attacking certain data might kind of de facto...
NEETs?
NEETs,
yeah. And that stands for not in education, employment, or training. Talk a little bit about what your takeaways are from this growing demographic.
There's a lot of worry about NEETs globally. People who are truly not participating in primary economic activities. What are they doing with their time? How are they getting income? Why aren't they being incorporated into the labor market or the training market or the higher education system? And there's data that suggests that the young NEETs, say under 30, are up all over the world. And that's very alarming, especially when you have the backdrop like, the conversations we're having about boys and men. So what I try to make clear is there are 3 reasons why we have NEETs, and it almost never changes, even though they can look a little different. So they either can't find a job or they can't take a job, and that's because the labor market is bad, they are disabled, or they are caregiving. And a weak labor market, disability and caregiving, you can look at a 20-year-old NEET or you can look at a 60-year-old NEET, and they would have one of those 3 reasons. Now, the makeup of that reason can change. Disability amongst an older person is going to look different than disability amongst a 25-year-old, whereas the rates of, say, addiction and substance use disorders tend to be much higher amongst younger populations, whereas a physical impairment is higher amongst older populations. But it's still basically a different flavor of the same problem, which is you are not physically able to work. Same with caregiving. You could be caregiving for a partner, a parent, or a child. And as someone ages, the likelihood of who that is changes, but it's still that they've got to take care of somebody and they can't take a job, or the labor market is bad.
What type of person background tends to over-index amongst the NEETs? And if you could offer any solutions or public policy solutions, what would you suggest?
The NEETs tend to be, in America at least, much more Black than white, much more female than male, and much more rural than urban, and come from low-income families as opposed to high-income families. 70% of NEETs don't have more than a high school degree. So that means they are truly just missing labor market opportunities, or they face discrimination in the labor market. So one thing I bring up that I think is often, if I were to critique the boys and men conversation in the U.S., one thing I think that doesn't come up enough is the criminal justice system in felony records clearing. And the unemployment rate of people who are returned citizens, who have served their time and are no longer incarcerated is, I would hazard a guess, if we measured it appropriately, will always be the highest unemployment rate in the U.S. because discrimination against people who have a felony degree is so high. And in some ways, our society is producing NEETs because we are producing so many felons, because we have a criminal justice system in desperate need of reform. And if you were to ask me, what is the thing you could do to help men the most in the U.S., I would point to criminal justice reform because they're disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system. The other thing I would point to is addiction. It is very sad, but substance use disorders are much higher amongst men than they are amongst women. And that creates a large, a portion of disability amongst men that women don't share. So being able to do things like expand Medicaid, the single largest provider of substance use disorder treatment in the United States, as opposed to cut it, would be ways to help a population that is on the edge. But my take on the NEETs has long been, we know where they come from. The question is why we don't help them.
So I'm just doing the steelman for more conservatives or more conservative ideology. Is some of it that NEETs, would you have a reduction in NEETs, quite frankly, if the incentives were changed and that is there were fewer social programs? Or, I mean, I hear about NEETs and I think, well, how are they eating? And is it because they're living off of their parents and have their parents' Netflix and phone and living in mom's basement? Or is it because in some instances, and I don't think this is true, but I'll put it out there, that sometimes it's just not worth it to go to work?
Nah, you trap more flies with honey. The U.S. has tried to put work requirements or on various social programs for the past 30 years, and the evidence is very conclusive. It really doesn't increase work because a work requirement doesn't change or alter a barrier to work. And if I can't find childcare, it doesn't matter if you take away food stamps. I still won't find childcare. So if my grandma is sick and someone has to take care of her, I'm on food stamps. But if you take it away from me, like someone still has to take care of her. And as we've gone through, I would say, eras of work requirements being added to social programs, we have not seen labor force participation increase.
Yeah.
So if there were some kind of massive effect from adding a work requirement to a program, you should be able to see it pretty quickly. And you're not seeing it in their labor force participation, you're not seeing it in their earnings. While at the same time, the evidence around making the labor market more amenable to people who can't necessarily work full time, those returns are there and obvious. So one thing I point out to people is that Americans love to think that we're hard workers. We're a country that values work, but we have lower work rates than almost all of Europe. And it's in part because we're so mean to people who can't take a full-time job as is. And I talk a lot about childcare and how much childcare would help labor force participation. Like, forget helping children. If you have a place where children under 5 can go for free, their moms will work more.
We're the only G7 nation that doesn't offer it, right?
But in past studies of women's labor force participation in Europe, they've found that actually the bigger factor for getting women to work is having the right to part-time jobs. And if you followed the head of Citibank, one of the few financial institutions that has not required 5 days a week return to office for all their employees, she has said publicly, if I had to work 5 days a week with kids under 5, I wouldn't have been able to keep my job. That's something that we actually can see in broad data in European countries, that the U.S. is missing workers. It's missing a lot of part-time workers. So take that person with a disability who has to go to the doctor every week or has to go to some version of physical therapy. They can't work 40 hours, but they can work 30, but they're not allowed to.
I'm just curious, all of this, and then I'll flip it back to Ed. Have you seen, Catherine, a series on Netflix called The Maid?
Oh, I read the book. Oh, that's such a pretentious thing to say. I'm so sorry. But I think The Maid is based on a book, right? It's a memoir.
I don't read books. I just watch Netflix, so I don't know.
This is where we meet.
But so many of the issues you're talking about, Ed, you don't know this because you're probably watching TikTok all day, but a lot of the issues we're talking about come to life, and that's why I think art is just so important. But a lot of the issues you're bringing up in a fairly sober, anodyne way come to life in this series. I think it's really powerful, and it makes you really feel for this, what you'd call needs. Anyways, back to you, Ed.
In terms of some solutions to this, it sounds like you think free and universal childcare would be a huge help. Is there anything else that you think would solve this issue?
Some of them are very low budget. Something like universal access to paid sick leave. In certain cities where they've done this, they've studied the earnings of workers who are brought under sick leave protection, and they find as much as a $3,000 a year difference in the amount of annual earnings of, say, women without a college degree who have a child when she has access to sick leave. Now, she's not taking $3,000 worth of sick days. She's basically having stability in employment, that if she calls in sick, she doesn't lose earnings or her job. Because you can still be fired in the US for calling in sick. So if you happen to be the caretaker of the most sick population in the US, aka a kid under 5 who gets on average 8 colds a year, you've basically introduced unstable earnings into a household simply because her earnings are now dependent on the health of her kid. So when you take that out of the equation and you add protection for workers who call in sick and even compensation for workers who call in sick, she earned $3,000 more a year because her earnings were more stable. $3,000 a year is more than the child tax credit currently. There's about 30 million workers in the U.S. who don't have access to paid sick leave. That is an easy change. That could make a huge difference for people who are affected by it. But we don't really think of not having a sick day as being a source of employment instability, but it absolutely is. So basic labor regulations to make it easier for people to maintain employment in the wake of lives that we lead, paid family and medical leave. You could take the bold decision to do things like establish the right to work part-time or have flexible work arrangements. You could absolutely make that part of our labor law. It's labor law in a lot of countries that would be considered our peers. And then you can make the big social investments like childcare, a cash allowance for children. You could expand Medicaid. You could do lots of things. And we've done none of them. I think I said this last time I was here. Remember, we've done almost none of them. So there's just sky's the limit. there's so much we can do.
It's interesting because so much of this revolves around childcare, which I think makes sense. So when you just think it through logically, of course, that's a big reason that we're seeing these discrepancies in terms of employment. What are your thoughts on the trad wife trend? This is the cultural trend that has gained a lot of steam recently, this idea that, women should go back to taking up the traditional role of staying at home and being the homekeeper, taking care of the children, making the meals, etc. I feel as if this is a big piece of what we're discussing here. What are your thoughts on that whole cultural trend that I believe has gotten a lot more popular recently?
For women who are supposed to stay at home, they make an awful lot of money from social media. I wrote a column about this, I think it was maybe a year and a half ago, that trad wives are the new multi-level marketing. And they show us essentially a fundamental weakness in our labor market, which is that high-quality part-time work for women doesn't exist. And that women want to earn money for their families, but they can't take a 9-to-5 job. Or they don't want to take a 9-to-5 job because they don't want to miss after school or things on the weekends. And so we have basically, eliminated from our labor market the idea that you could work in a job that pays a decent amount of money and still be part-time. For us, part-time means low-wage shift sector, which isn't worth a mom's time. So the Mary Kay and Tupperware and all the multi-level marketing, LuLaRoe. I don't know if you, Scott, if you're a documentary person, that was a Hulu documentary on the LuLaRoe craze. It's just a lot of moms who want to earn more money from their family, but still want to have the agency to have control over their family life.
It's what gave rise to eBay in the 90s.
Yeah, or Etsy now. I mean, moms want to earn money. They know that money helps with raising children. They know it helps give opportunities for children that lack of money won't get, and we just close the doors. And so it's almost like the whack-a-mole. The labor market can be a privilege from a lot of people's perspective. So if you close it down, they're just going to pop up somewhere else. And I see trad wives as just a very remunerative way of selling something.
And the Maha movement.
Yeah, you're selling culture, you're selling ideas. You're not selling patterned tights or, cosmetics anymore, but you're still selling something as a hustle to bring in money for your family. And so I think I have been told that I can be quite dismissive of the trad wife movement because I see the economics of it and maybe not the culture behind it. People will live their lives. People will make choices. They'll make choices for their family, and then some people will make money off of that. And I just see them as two separate things.
I'm so glad you say that. The economics are the part of the conversation that people just decide to willingly ignore. And it is so funny, that paradox of you've got all these trad wives on social media who are sort of saying, oh, I don't work, I stay at home, I cook and I take care of the kids. Meanwhile, they are working because they're posting it, they're filming it, they're doing their brand collaborations, they're making money off of doing it. So I'm sorry, you're pretending that you're not working. I'm watching your video in real time. You're making money off of me watching this. You are working as we speak.
So new Mary Kay. It's great. And they're making a lot of money, and good for them. They figured out a way to be like a one-woman, Tupperware. I can't begrudge them earning money. when I don't think that would exist to any degree that we see it now if we had a high paid part-time labor market. And it's absolutely missing. And this is how you see it show up.
And it's also just this myth, because it's like the reason, I mean, a lot of people would stay at home and chill and relax and hang out with their dogs and their kids if they wanted to, but we are pretending as if there's this other thing that doesn't exist, which is we need to make enough money to pay the bills. And the reality is a lot of these men don't make enough money for the wife to just stay at home and take care of the children. You need to figure out new sources of income. That is where we're headed right now. I wish that were more prevalent in the cultural conversation.
What's interesting is I write for Bloomberg, right? So I mean, you can imagine like the Bloomberg terminal and Bloomberg people who can actually afford the subscription to Bloomberg News, right? We're talking a very select set of people, and yet the most popular column, bar none, that I have ever written in my years for writing for Bloomberg is "Marry Rich." That's the Republican plan for families. Because it's not as if Republicans in lieu of, like, if we think women should stay home, well, then you're in favor of universal cash welfare, that every kid and mom gets money so that if they can't afford to stay home, you're going to make them stay home. That doesn't exist. If you think women should go out and work, you should have childcare. That doesn't exist. And so if you take all of the policies that Republicans oppose off the table, the only one left for women is to marry rich. And I don't know why. I don't know if maybe that was like it like the column header maybe looked like a how-to, and that's why so many finance pros clicked on it. But it was very popular, and I got a lot of feedback of people feeling like they were trapped.
Yes.
When you put in these expectations that this is what you have to do, and you impose that structure on a family, and you impose that structure on an economy, and you follow it up. I mean, what I think I missed in that column, and I have some like big column regrets. I think what I missed in that column, and I wish I had said, is that is American public policy right now. It's not that it's the Republican plan. That is the law of the land. You need to marry rich because we are not going to offer you any type of alternative. And I think I could have swung harder, and I didn't, to make that point. And if we didn't want to put so much on just find a high income breadwinner that will take care of you and we're going to do nothing else, there's so much that we can do. But to kind of go back to this cultural conversation, I see it as, it's always a two-way street in terms of causality. You're just looking at the width of the lanes. I think in part, one of the reasons why we're seeing this like flourishing of women should stay home and we should have trad wife culture and like the men should go out and work. I've heard more in the past 6 months that the reason why men don't make enough money is because women are working. And I was pretty sure that we settled that like back in the 80s. And I now have women DM me on Instagram to say, can you tell me what to say to my husband? Because he says it's women's fault that men don't earn enough money. That's a sidebar. But I see it coming as like a defense mechanism because the policy world of marry rich and nothing else is on the government's tab is under severe attack because childcare is so expensive, because childcare is unreliable, because families are buckling under the weight of inflation and they need more money and they need some type of service for the government to step in. Market failure meets families on 6 different fronts on any given day because we have problems in health insurance, we have problems in housing, we have problems in transportation, we have problems in elder care and childcare. And the government is basically trying to defend a really small piece of real estate that is ultimately unpopular. And so I kind of see this like flourishing of cultural arguments for women staying home almost as being like a last gasp of like, no, us not solving any problems is better because this is the way we want it. And I see it as almost like a transparent, like, okay, nice try. We're going to have to have some type of paid family leave situation in 2025. And I think I see the cultural arguments that way too. So I'm not just that women earn money off of trad wifing, but that pushing the trad wife agenda is a get out of jail free card for your government's lack of investment in the family.
I think the reason that article went viral or was so popular is, one, it was provocative, but I think, two, you are telling the hard truth. And it is the truth that the direction of our policy is, for women at least, you should marry rich. And I think this is part of the subtext of all these conversations that I feel like people seem to forget is part of the design of the marry rich agenda is a dependency on the man. That's part of the setup there. If the only way that you get to participate in the economy is through establishing some sort of a dependency on the man's ability to go out and earn an income and make enough money for the family, then you are disenfranchising the woman's ability to be free and independent and make her own choices. And I think these are kind of these issues that we litigated years and years and years ago, like the suffragette movement. I thought we sort of tackled all of that, but it does seem we're kind of slowly and quietly and surreptitiously going back to that conversation. And this, to me, seems to be the part that a lot of men that we don't want to acknowledge is actually, if we have that again, we're going to have a lot more power in our relationships and also in the world at large, and women are going to have less power for themselves. At least that's my view.
I mean, I would push back and say that the idea of marry rich being a policy does a disservice to men as well.
Okay.
And the expectation of success, the definition of success and what it means to be, what men's job is, gets a lot more incumbent on things out of their control. And it's a recipe for failure and inadequacy if there's only one, for both genders, right? It's a recipe for failure and inadequacy if you only have one version of success, one version of what you're supposed to do, and that is what gets peddled. I think the problems for women are pretty obvious because it's economic empowerment that we're leaving on the table because we don't get to work as a higher rates, or we don't get to earn as much money, or we have to pull back. But I think that there's just as much disempowerment on the men's side. It just doesn't show up in the same way. And in some ways, the women's disempowerment is easier to measure because we can look at things like earnings. But I don't think that these types of cultural expectations do either gender any favor. And that really, the way that I see the economy as being its truly strongest is supporting people where they are and not making people come to them. I heard about this a lot in terms of fertility because fertility rates are declining in the U.S. And there's lots of questions of, if the U.S. population starts to decline, our economy gets a lot harder to manage. But if people want fewer kids, genuinely want fewer kids, we should not hinge our economic fate on convincing them otherwise. Like, our economy is strong when it meets the preferences of the people inside it, whatever they are, as opposed to having people perform to keep the economy propped up. And I see that as a fundamental source of weakness, that we try to get people to alter their lives so much just to meet the economy, when really the economy, we have so much money and so much policymaking and so much sophistication and the ability to do so much. We should meet people where they are. We being the proverbial economy.
I want to know what's going on in Scott's head right now.
Yeah, but just in terms of meeting people's preferences, which I really like, my sense is that, there's a lot of factors here. As women become more educated, birth rates go down. So in some ways, it's a sign of a healthy economy or a healthy democracy. At the same time,